moving a little bit towards the governance issue of how exactly do we control how this is done, and what role does the public play in helping to provide information for the public good. So we're going to be talking about governance, and my first speaker I'm pleased to introduce is Jeff Tiley, who has been promoted since I last saw him. He's now he's the chief economist at the TUC, and that doesn't mean to say he's been elevated above the shop floor. He's still there. Thank you, Jeff.
So it was Tony's title, for which apologies. So I did have some quite elaborate historical remarks prepared, but in the light of yesterday, it didn't seem quite right when the Prime Minister is insisting we talk about the future. So I changed it a bit. So first I'm going to make some remarks about the statistical context for the election. Then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about where trade unions come from in the inflation debate, and then I'm going to, as required, talk about governance and a bit of this. I've put my history in that bit. Yesterday was kind of peculiar. We had a general election called on an inflation day, on the day that inflation was meant to return virtually to target. It didn't quite fall as close as expected, but you know. And that was the CPI measure, of course, reinforcing the Prime Minister's narrative about a better future of figures on real pay, which has seen positive real annual growth for 10 months. So that one's based on CPIH. And then lastly there was GDP, that's sort of third, which rebounded into the first quarter of this year. And it was a bit unfortunate this morning to hear the Prime Minister on the Today programme cite the ONS spokesman saying that the economy was going gangbusters. So I'm not sure is entirely helpful. And just on the whole infrastructure of these 7 o'clock releases and the somewhat incestuous relationship with the Today programme, I wonder if we should put that under the spotlight a bit. The ONS always say they don't want us to overreact to 1 month's data, but mechanisms are now in place that basically guarantee that overreaction. And I'm not just saying that because 7 a.m. starts are highly disruptive, but they are. And, I think we should take seriously, Philip Inman, I know, from The Guardian, I know, is exercised about this particularly. But I think the same infrastructure aids the Prime Minister in his urge to talk about the future rather than the past, because it's impossible to have a sensible discussion of the economy without the relevant context. And maybe up to a point, providing this context is the role of institutions like the TUC. And we are very clear that the past 14 years have been unprecedentedly bad, just to be clear that this is being recorded, and that we think a great part of this is down to policy. Some of the media do give the relevant context to give them their dues, though perhaps some are a bit too generous to policy. My personal bête noire is the universal reversion to productivity being at fault. That's a specific bugbear. But it does really feel like we're up against the latest figures in floodlights and the past very much in the dark. Let me talk about inflation. We lost it. Oh, yeah, it's something to do with.
It's not come on, blokes.
So,
Fell asleep.
Yeah, it falls asleep. So, on inflation measurement, I hope the position of trade unions has been clear throughout. We'll just read the first bit. This year, our Congress, the Congress debated a motion called Motion 19, RPI Save the Rate, which was proposed by the GMB Union. Congress believes the planned abolition of RPI represents an attack on millions of workers and pensioners' living standards and a permanent deepening of the cost of living crisis. Come back to the other bits. I think we've been consistent in our position on inflation measurement since the latest round of controversies that followed basically in the wake of clothing measurement on one hand, but also in the wake of austerity on the other hand. And we of course find quite interesting, the conjuncture of policy and measurement issues. We dutifully respond to consultations, and our responses, both from the TUC and from individual unions, show that we are engaged and feel strongly about the issues debated. I think, too, that they show we have considered and relevant views. And this has been the case. We've been involved in the debate about inflation measurement, perhaps for as long as it existed. It's said here, trade unions have always fought for an inflation measure that reflects working people's cost of living as a foundation for collective bargaining. The onus on always fought. And I think that's how it should be. Inflation measurement should involve a dialogue between interested parties. So when it comes to governance, my fear is that dialogue is not really what has been happening. Struggle is the word that comes to mind. And a struggle against discourse that has become excessively technocratic. And by technocratic, I mean dominated by a certain kind of expert. And we've heard from one of them today, but fortunately they've gone. The expert brings dense maths and sometimes a kind of theory, economic theory, to the table. There's also an institutional dimension, with the Treasury and the Bank of England key proponents of this type of discourse, and obviously not just for inflation targeting. And of course, with big institutions like this, they have an outside voice in the debate. One striking fault line has been the unwillingness of the Royal Statistical Society to go along with this discourse, for which I continue to think they should be commended. Nonetheless, the discourse has been hardwired into present governance arrangements. Panels are arranged so that the stakeholder panel explores issues which are then resolved by the technical panel. And I have a sense of being lectured sometimes by the technical panel. At the inception of these panels 10 years ago, we were handed the Johnson Review, which I've still got my copy, which set a very specific course. We heard a bit about it earlier. The course was kind of polarised, RPI bad, CPIH good, Carley bad, Jevons good, rental equivalence good, other approaches bad. There was even an effort at having CPIH as the measure that would resolve everything. So my use of the word struggle follows from my experience of attempting to resist this course with others, of course. So my original plan was to labour this, the point that I don't find the discourse very compelling on a number of grounds. But I'm just going to concentrate on a couple of points, so I rejig my slides. And I'm going to do so by looking at the contributions of one, so forget about the motion, the contribution of one W. Irwin Dewart, okay, that is how you pronounce his name. And he was brought in by the ONS in 2012 to resolve the formula debate. Got the slide? I hope this makes my point about access to the debate being restricted. This is a sample, one page, of 75 pages of algebra. But beyond this, bringing Dewart in to resolve the formula debate is like bringing in Richard Dawkins to a debate about the existence of God. Beyond the present parochial beyond the sort of present focus on clothing in the UK, the US Boskin Review of 1996 remains the most critical event in global inflation measurement. Though again, it can't be removed from the policy context because the US were just about to issue index-linked government debt, TARPs maybe they're called, I can't remember. Dewart, in fact, wrote the scene-setting paper in the mid-1990s for the Boskin Review, and he addressed various perceived upward biases. On the formula, so this is 1995 I think, on the formula he urged statistical agencies to, quote, follow the emphatic advice of Irving Fisher and avoid the use of the Carley arithmetic measure of price relatives formula to form elementary price aggregates. And of course, and then we move on to 2012, and of course he was doing the same thing still. His paper cites Fisher 124 times. I counted, yeah. A further point that his contribution illustrates is arguments changing form very quickly. If you read the first quote, in 1995, he rejected the Carley using the so-called economic argument. So he said, however, as Pearson observed 100 years ago, consumers do purchase less in response to higher prices, i.e. substitution effects do exist. The existing theory of cost of living indices can be viewed as a way to incorporate these substitution effects into the measurement of price change. So he was basing his argument to reject the Carley measure on the economic argument. But by 2012, he'd wholly switched to focus on the axiomatic argument. And he says, arguments that attempt to justify the use of the Carley index on the basis of the economic approach to elementary indices that are presented on pages 364 to 369 of the Consumer Price Index Manual cannot be used to justify the use of the Carley index. So he was junking his own advice at this point, though he was generous to himself in not referring to his past contribution. Instead, he blames the Consumer Price Index Manual. But the striking thing about the debate is that everybody has followed course. So when the House of Lords summed up the evidence of those who rejected Carley, the common thread across all the contributions that they reviewed was this axiomatic argument, and specifically the time reversal argument, and equally this appeal to Irving Fisher. So Chris Giles talks about price bouncing. Professor Martin Wheel gave an example of price bouncing. Jill will make the point about it has to be changed, as well as everything else. Ben Broadbent talked about price bouncing. Again, cites Irving Fisher. Robert Hill cites Irving Fisher, talks about price bouncing. They talk about Paul Johnson's review that talked about price bouncing, and then finally they conclude that the feature of the Carley formula was identified by William Stanley Jevons in 1863. People don't cite Jevons' arguments against the Carley formula for some reason, which I'm sort of thinking about. I don't think I need to tell you that failing the price reversal test does not prove that Carley is worse than Jevons. Not even if it's repeated by lots of distinguished people. That doesn't mean to say that Carley's perfect or flawless, but it doesn't prove that the Carley is worse than Jevons. I don't know whether to do this, but I think I ought to point out that Fisher is a very controversial figure. I know there's been some discussion, some reflection perhaps in the statistics profession about eugenics, but Fisher's position was pretty exceptional. At the time of pretty much at the same time of his 1920s contributions, he was a founder member and the first president of the American Eugenics Society. I'm not going to read that, but and I can't say for sure whether it's perfectly accurate about him, but I don't think there's any doubt that he was a big figure. And it may be that his scientific preeminence was at the time related to his willingness to support these profoundly toxic public policy positions. If I was being sceptical about his position on price indices, it might seem to me plausible in this light that he might support a technical position that at face value contains the pay of the working classes. I don't know, but I don't believe that our professions are adequately, I don't mean just, this is statistics, but it's also economics. I don't think we've explored this properly, but maybe you should use Fisher with caution. So to conclude, this is Simone Weil, or W-E-I-L's Weil apparently in French. She's a French philosopher writing in the last year of her short life. She says in this commentary called Human Personality, scientists of the same class are equally enslaved by fashion, which rules over science even more despotically than over the shape of hats. For these men, the collective opinion of specialists is practically a dictatorship. So that's what I worry. This sort of expert opinion is just slavery to fashion, and slavery to fashion has not led us to a good place. The terrible resolution that condemns RPI to become CPIH, the repeated blunders on the H part of CPIH, the fact that ONS headlines CPIH every month and nobody uses it. I want a theory that permits nuance, that doesn't think that there is one answer to everything. I want an institutional structure where Mark Courtney's work for the Unison Union, seeking to rehabilitate the economic approach, is not simply rejected out of hand and allowed to vanish without trace. I want a structure that listens to wider public opinion rather than waste their time with consultations and a House of Lords inquiry that are ignored, rejected or disregarded. I don't know if we have lost the RPI. If so, I hope that Jill and John's HCI can be a vehicle for positive change. But I think that this might involve some deeper reflection on processes and authority in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, we have a few questions, maybe. Jill, please.
Yes, actually, it's not a question. I just want to add a bit to what you said about the Carly and where you quoted all the people who said it was a bad index. And if your prices went up and went down again, it showed a rise. That's true of the chained version of the Carly, but not of the direct version, which is the version used in the UK, which doesn't have that problem. There is a bit of a problem across the annual chain link. That's getting a bit more technical, but there are reasons why Carly can overestimate, but it's as the RSS has always said, it's not Carly, it's the combination of Carly and the type of data set. Certain data sets don't work well with Carly, and that's what happened with the classes.
Any questions of Jeff? Sure.
If I can just add one bit of reinforcement of Mark Courtney's work.
Reinforcement rather than questions.
One of the reasons why the RPI came under fire was his work said that using the RPI led to GDP numbers being up to 0.5% a year lower using it. Therefore, the new system has a higher GDP number for the same set of numbers.
I mean, the thing that one of the areas where debate is preoccupied at the moment is measurement of real incomes, isn't it? Real wages. If you use CPIH, real wages just back above where they were in 2008. If you use CPI, they're not back. If you use RPI, they're way below. And if you use the HCIs, they're some way below as well. So these measurement issues that are somehow have grown into public debate in a big way are contingent on the same issue. So it's a big deal. And it's been a long time. And that's you said it. I think we established that Jill and I were the longest standing members of the stakeholder panels. We got this 10 years ago, didn't we?
Yes, I'm not sure. Yes, I've still got mine.
Specifically within the sign ask something. Do you, as a stakeholder, as a representative of the public in the public good, do you feel the stakeholder panel is useful? Is listened to? Has any influence on that?
I mean, it's obviously useful. It's right that it should exist, and it's right that it should have the people on it who are on it. Maybe it might be possible to have a broader representation. I don't know, but I think my point is that this distinction between the two panels, that there are people who can give a user perspective, and then there are people who can solve the issues that the users are interested in. It doesn't work, partly because most of the people on the stakeholder panel have expertise anyway, so we don't like being told the right answer by the other group or something. Yeah. So it is a bit blurred. But the point is, in the past, panels were convened to discuss specific issues. They would thrash it out and they would put out a report. So it was presumed that the people on the panel were able to discuss these things.
Sometimes the RPI, you're referring to the RPI committee.
Yes.
Yeah, sometimes they had a technical subgroup to look at a particular point in detail.
I mean, you've always talked about the 86 panel, it was 86 or 85. That's a particularly good example
86,
of
yes.
discourse and dialogue.
Well, no, that made the point that public credibility was just as important as technical soundness.
So it disappeared. Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. I hope we'll come back to debate some of these aspects of Jeff's. Thank you very much. Really long-standing public servant, and was for many years
Public irritant.
Well, he feels that perhaps he's been more of a public irritant, but I don't think he's irritated the public so much as a few people in public office. That he was for many years supporter of PACAC and knows quite a lot about this area. So thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you, Tony. Already referred to, I think this 86 report would have been one of the RPI Advisory Committee reports, and in a sense, in the old days when we were all young, I sense that system used to work quite well for governing the inflation figures. There was wide societal representation on these things. There was public sessions, topics for discussion and conclusions all put in public. Parliamentary reports were published. The statisticians then went and did what was said. Sadly, then around when Gordon Brown was Chancellor, politicians and the civil servants between them really sought to seize control of data and of the inflation figures in particular. And the Statistics Act of 2007, which is much praised, in my view, with the benefit of hindsight, largely cemented that political control. And the quasi-independent AXA has duly fallen into line. Now, the structure of the Act, I think, was probably not problematic in itself, and I don't really blame the people at the time, although it took me a while to come round to the view that it's flawed. But as is often the case, I think, with these things, structural issues in such acts only become a problem when either the events which are unforeseen or one of the major players develops some sense of ill intent, and unfortunately we've had both when it comes to inflation. So barely had the Statistics Act settled when the ONS made one of its most dramatic mistakes, already referred to by other speakers, when it messed up the clothing component of the RPI in 2010. I think it was only about 4% of the index or something, but they managed to mess it up so much that it actually distorted the entire index. Now, why such changes were allowed to be made without testing, we'll probably never know. Why were they rushed? I don't know. Why is there still no policy, it seems, on how change is managed in the inflation indices? Why is there no public visibility of these things? Ed spoke earlier about whether the ONS is a body that might struggle with changes. You know, I think the fact that the ONS couldn't manage a change in a minuscule component of the inflation figures should make us all really frightened about what it could do in the years ahead if there isn't proper governance. There were then a series of professional failings in the years after 2010 that led to AXA failing to tackle the actual problems with the RPI. It would have been easy to do, as trivial to change it back as it was to change it away in the first place. No one, of course, was held accountable for that failure of professional competence and leadership and management. The problem is, I don't think AXA's even learned from that, because there are lots of problems with the CPI. It has all sorts of weaknesses, and you've heard about some today. You don't have to Google very far to find many others, but whether it's rents we've heard about, or quality adjustments on laptops, or my recent discovery on water bills. No time to go into this today, but you know, why are these changes not discussed and debated and then worked on openly with users? That is what would have happened under the old system in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s. As my earlier question asked, should revised data such as we had recently with the rent data lead to revisions in the index in the past? Well, you know, where's the policy and the debate about that? I still don't see it, and I'm not sure Ed gave an answer that totally satisfied that. Now, this all matters because it harms lives and livelihoods. And events of the last 15 years have led to more pension providers, largely at the Treasury behest, and following their Treasury example, to save money and move the up ratings from RPI, which was common practice, to CPI, which is now common practice. And this matters to recipients because, as you know, the CPI is generally a lower annual rate than the RPI. And that shift for up ratings in the last decade, 12 years I think it is, has led to the loss of 20% of increase in income for pensioners and those on benefits. When you look at what are the root causes of the post-COVID rise in poverty and various social ills, I'm not sure you have to look an awful lot further than this. Benefits have been squeezed over 20 years, and then a shock comes along like that, and you're left with several million people and families who are simply incapable of dealing with the shock because the fat has been taken totally away. Now, these failures, and I think the resulting poverty, reflect poor governance of the statistical system. Now, I'll run through these quickly, you've heard most of them, but the 2007 Act actually excuses the inflation figures from whatever constraints the governance would put it under by making it an exception. The existing inflation committees that there was just a discussion about are, they might or might not work, but they're not open to the public, they're not open to me, they're not transparent. OSR is largely, oddly and uniquely absent from this debate of statistics. Again, Ed didn't answer that question earlier as to why they simply refuse to write reports on this topic. Rarely and not properly is inflation ever discussed at the AXA board. I think twice in the last 10 years it has been, and it was a sort of utterly trivial conversation. Too much reliance on unaccountable reviews, such as that of Paul Johnson. I think he used to be a deputy chief economic advisor or senior bod in the Treasury, so he knew exactly what the Treasury wanted from that review. But why it was needed to be structured in that way, I don't know. User engagement minimal. Pressure from key users such as the OBR and the Bank of England is unclear. There's recently a published Leavesley report which ignored inflation in good part because it was told to, and Parliament is largely ignored. And if I can just dwell on that final point of Parliament for a few moments. I was, for some years, up to 2019, the advisor of the principal committee of PACAC, and over the years that I worked with it, a dozen reports were produced on data, and I think about 200 of the recommendations that were made on statistics have yet to be addressed by AXA, ONS and OSR. And I think that indicates something pretty shocking about how successive AXA boards, national statisticians, the OSR, the ONS, this collective sort of blob, have actually treated Parliament. They really, they really don't care. They can do whatever they like. It's got worse since I left PACAC because ONS now staffs PACAC with its own people. So this means that when any of the senior staff from AXA turn up at the committee, they've had a part in forming the questions that they are going to be asked, and they've seen the questions before they turn up. You can rest assured there will never be a tricky question asked of them as long as this arrangement lasts. AXA also ignores the intent of other parliamentary committees. I mean, there's the law, I couldn't see the slide, but I think it was the Lords Committee on Inflation that you had up on there, wasn't it? I mean, I could tell you what they said and what their conclusions were if they weren't on that slide, but it doesn't really matter because AXA ignored it. This is a broad-based failure of the system. And it's not just the formal structures of governance that have failed, but it's also the way that AXA, and the way that many other such bodies operate, so I'm not really picking on them about it, just choose to operate themselves. And Jeff sort of hinted at some of these before, but I'd like to, in a sense, probably repeat some of what Jeff has said. But the first is that it does surround itself by this small number of experts from this sort of technocratic elite that Jeff referred to. And it's the same names that keep appearing on this sort of merry-go-round of whatever it is, conducting reviews, being commissioned for consulting, advising, whatever that is, pitching for funding and chairing committees. And they're all this sort of senior and honorary academics or retired civil servants on the boards of think tanks, and fully engaged in this sort of glorious sort of middle class Davos-style international conference circuit. They are by definition very successful people, and almost without exception, they're extremely nice people. But you have to say their life experiences and generally their very sound personal financial situation with decent earnings and pensions means that they're so far removed from the people who feel the pain from the very real impact of the decisions they take. Secondly, there has been a bit of a merry-go-round of staff, and my apologies to Stephen, but he's just arrived from the bank to take a very senior job here. I haven't looked at the ONS staff recently, but there was an extraordinary moment a decade or so ago when the foremost senior staff affecting Price's policy in the ONS, from the chief economist down, had between them just over a century of work experience in the Treasury. So if they didn't between them know what the Treasury wanted, well, I'll let you finish that line for yourself, actually. Critically, though, this is a group that is at huge risk of groupthink, and they also happen to be totally resistant to any external challenge. In a slightly discordant view with Jeff, actually, I would say that AXA and those in its orbit have actually now successfully worked to undermine the principal external challenge, which was the Royal Statistical Society. Now, the RSS has got a long and proud history of being a critical friend of the system, but the relationship between the two has changed in the last decade, and especially in the last 5, 6, 7 years. What has happened to financial support, staffing, selection of volunteers, the support for user groups in particular, this would not be a pleasant story if anyone chose to write it down. And tragically, I think for those of us who speak at these events, there was a major event they held in 2018. And unfortunately, the recording, the transcript, the papers that 20 or 30 people produced that used to be on our RSS website vanished without trace. An accident, I'm sure, I hasten to add. So what we've got here is a description of the failure of government. The last week has all been about postmasters and infected blood scandals, and I do wonder whether one day the story of government statistics will be viewed in the same light. I genuinely believe many-fold more people have been harmed by this government's failing. Now, I really hope that AXA will feel it needs to deal with these issues, but I doubt it will, because there's no pressure on it to change. I did have high hopes for the recently produced Leavesley report, which was originally called for in the final PACAC Parliamentary Report of 2019, but sadly that won't force their hand either. And perhaps my final thought is that it was said at a meeting on this Leavesley report yesterday that it was surely poor drafting from the Cabinet Office that the review remit asked it to focus on the statistical needs of government. I'm pretty convinced if Denise Leavesley herself, AXA, the system, Robert Choate, the rest of them wanted that drafting changed, they could have got it changed. So I think it's deliberate. And I think we see the result of that in these inflation figures, because the government, for reasons explained in that conversation just now, wants the lowest inflation figure possible, and the system it's created and nurtures is certainly managing to deliver it.
Are there any questions for Simon? Or yes, Jill.
Yes, thanks. Simon, I find listening to you a little difficult, because there are some things with which you've said that I 100% agree with. Certainly it was a mistake, pure and simple, by ONS in 2010 that led to the problem with clothing and started the whole problem with RPI. And certainly UKSA at the time did not look at this, or give it the attention it deserved and did not, and took completely the wrong path. I would like to think, and I think there are some arguments for saying that now, because the role of the status of the OSR is definitely improved compared to the past, that might not happen. We can't be sure. Certainly I agree that there is far too much reliance on economic theory and rather abstruse technical arguments, and that certainly the importance of simplicity is overlooked. I think you go a bit far, to be honest, in saying that there's almost a great conspiracy theory. I don't think ONS is quite that bad. In fact, I don't think people in ONS are that bad. Maybe I'm too naive, but I don't think so. My experience on the stakeholder panel, the first few meetings, and I've been on it, as Jeff said, since the beginning, I practically felt like crying when I came out of, because of the difficulty of getting over the sorts of points that I felt needed to be got over. But it's changed a lot. I do agree with Denise that it needs to be more open who is on there. It's a stakeholder panel, so it has to be representative, so it's quite reasonable that TUC, RS, Royal Statistical Society, and Treasury and Bank of England actually have representatives. Whether there should be some others, there's probably a good case for it, and certainly it should be clearer who's on it as of right, as it were. So that's what I wanted to say.
I think the main criticism there, from a certain point of view, was in a sense that the RSS. I mean, Grant is here, and I'm sure he's perfectly capable of defending the
Well, can I say?
ONS if necessary. But the RSS.
I was going to say, yeah, the RSS, I think you...
Well, I feel I have to say something, because you use the phrase conspiracy, and I didn't use that phrase.
Sorry,
and I don't actually believe that. And I've spent a lot of time in the last 10 years being incredibly interested how a lot of the work through PACAC, which has looked at an awful lot of areas where public policy has simply failed. And I don't think it is because all of the players in it are trying to achieve something which is not what they are meant to be achieving. It is something about the way these bodies are now constructed that leads to these outcomes happening. I don't think everybody, all of the doctors and scientists and everything else in the blood scandal were terrible people, nor were all the employees of the post office and all the employees of Fujitsu. But people find themselves in these systems and have to operate in a certain way. And it's often just a nugget of an idea at the top, which I don't think counts as conspiracy. But I can't remember who said it earlier, but it's the idea that the Treasury wants a low inflation figure because it makes everything else look good. Now, there's this sort of nugget of an idea which then feeds its way imperceptibly through people's mindsets to delivering certain outcomes or resisting things that might not deliver it. So I don't think it's a conspiracy. I think it's an accident, an unfortunate way we're set up.
Any other questions? Can we move on to yes, Sean?
Oh, that's one. It's actually Arthur Barnett's point, who was referred to earlier. And his question would be, would it be better if these supposedly independent bodies like the OSR were taken back into the government department? And the reason for that would be there is at least then some accountability. The relevant minister can be questioned in Parliament. As we stand with these bodies, OSR, AXA and so on, who can question?
Yeah, exactly.
You see what I mean in terms of changing things.
I'd like to raise come up. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed.